Hey guys, this is Mark Stoos with Accelerating Value, your weekly podcast where we talk about value, right? How we create it, how we think about it, how we define it, how we invest in it, how we ultimately prove that it happened or didn't happen. So it's a fairly unique podcast. I'm not really aware of anyone else who's talking about value creation in the same way. We're very horizontal in terms of the people we talk to. We're also fairly vertical in terms of the people we talk to. So different industries, also within a function, will go deeper than a leader and hear what people who are further down in the organization, how they think about value. Is that really the best way to think about value? How do they ultimately connect their vision of value to what their C-suite member might consider value? So that's what this is all about, and as a result, we have some really great guests. And today is no exception. So today is Kevin Moriarty. So Kevin is a public company CFO. I first met him and worked with him at Honeywell Aerospace. So I was leading marketing and communications at Honeywell. And Kevin was the CFO for Honeywell Aerospace. And so he and I were frequently in conversation about this whole issue of value. So, Kevin, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
This is going to be a great conversation because, you're kind of the judge, jury, and sometimes executioner, right? In this whole conversation about value, right? Because you're not just as it applies to any one function like marketing, but you're really kind of looking across all of them, right? And you're making judgment calls or helping the team make judgment calls. And it's not just about are you delivering value, it's about relative value. It's the opportunity cost associated with different choices, presumably, that are creating value. So it's very much from your perspective, I think, this goes back to some of our previous conversations, like managing a financial portfolio. So I'm really excited about this.
All right, terrific. Let's
Awesome.
get at it.
So when you think about value creation, let's kind of set some fundamental ground rules for anyone who's listening. How does a CFO, even a growth-oriented CFO like you, how do they define value? I mean, is value sort of up for grabs here a little bit, or is there an actual definition that's kind of like this is a black letter concept?
Well, yeah, and again, this is all going to come from like my own perspective or my own kind of thought process. I think, from the CFO perspective, it's value is what type of revenue generation, earnings, cash flow that is only adding to the growth of the enterprise. Another dimension would be how are margins performing? Are we're getting the right value by seeing margin expansion, by creating products, services that are generating that incremental value to the organization. And I think from my lens, that it's monetary in many dimensions, right? It's not, thinking about, okay, what, say from an employee perspective, other perspectives, but as a leader, as the finance leader, as you're looking to grow the revenue, earnings, and cash flow of an organization, it will only create more opportunities for your employees, for your suppliers, for your customers, based on those services that you're creating. So to me, that's how I view to be value.
And so by definition, then, value is something that has monetized.
Correct. Again, being the finance guy, that's
definitely
a dimension of some importance to us.
Yeah, and I would say this, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I really wanted to have you on the show was if there's a language of business, that language is numbers. And you and people like you are the keeper of the numbers, right? I mean, you're yeah. Yep. So I mean, you're sort of the top of the pyramid in terms of interpreting value based on the number.
Yeah, I would definitely say that reporting, that measurement, the accountability, if you will, as well, based on, I think that's a key aspect of the finance function.
So how, regardless of who's doing it, how do you feel when someone approaches you with a business case that doesn't include how this investment is going to monetize to the benefit of the business, even though it may be part of a function that's, kind of like an accepted expense, right? But how do you feel about that?
Yeah, for me, I think when you sit down with a peer or somebody coming up in the organization itself, it's when you point out, okay, maybe it's not well thought out, or I definitely am a type of individual, I want to participate perhaps in those dialogues to frame. But so much of what I strive to do with leaders in the organization is, okay, we have to have some foundational plan. What are, say, going to be some of the KPIs and the milestones? I definitely come at it from incremental spend, if you will, to generate incremental return. And sitting down with a business leader, there's only so much available funding, right? So if I'm sitting down with a budget owner and that budget owner has a certain capacity, how have they thought about within their own function, maybe freeing up capacity to invest, or are they looking for the CFO, to figure out where else can we raise the money? But so much of it gets into, okay, what is the concept? What's the targeted area we're looking at? What's the plan? And how do we dimensionalize the plan? What KPIs are we looking at weekly, monthly, quarterly? How best are we going to frame it to judge some level of accountability in the organization? But I definitely come from it myself as incremental, meaning how do we demonstrate success with that level of investment to prove to ourselves that it's a valid idea, a valid concept, and then slowly, if it begins to take off, make sure that you get more incremental funding behind it. And that's always just been my own bias on the topic, is to kind of come in and sit down with the business leader, if they have an incremental idea, is to really make sure, okay, what's the market, what's our target, and then what are the right milestones or posts we're going to be looking at, and then what are the KPIs, what's those measurement? And earlier we were talking about value. So is it incremental sales? Is it incremental cash flow? Is it incremental? What is it that we're looking to do with that campaign?
And is there a time scale on this that you consider to be, for lack of a better way of putting it, acceptable or ideal? Like, you have a bias for rapid, super rapid payback, or like how are you balancing this in your head?
Sure, and I think it depends on the dimension of the ask and the size of the ask, right? I think if the ask is incremental, then and aligning with whatever the business leader is, that's part of the foundation of, okay, what's the plan? And if we collectively feel that this is something we should see a return on within, say, 1 quarter, 90 days, then that would be a dimension of time. And again, to me, Mark, it gets to what's the size of the ask. And also what I would say is it depends on what business cycle. Are we a long cycle business? Are we a short cycle business? What is it we're in? Because part of those investment decisions, if I'm in a short cycle business, like something that is really quick, I need to make calculated, I have a new product launch or I have something else happening, a new service offering, I may want to see a payback within, say, 1 to 2 quarters, because again, there's different dimensions of where you can invest dollars. But working with your peer and trying to figure out that measurement, and is this idea solid or not? And I'm a big proponent in, fail fast to the best you can, learn from it. But also, if you're successful, then how do you continue to feed that success? So I guess in answer to your question, it would go to what business are you in, and from a time dimension, unfortunately in the CFO suite, most suites you're living quarter to quarter, right? You're living 90 days to 90 days. But I also think as a CFO, you need to be making truncated risk calculations on something that will pay out in 9 months, 12 months, that time dimension. And that's a tricky equation that, everybody among the executive team has to play. And I'd say, notably the CFO.
Yeah, when I was at HP, they had a number of classes that they took some people and put them into, and one of them was about this issue, and it was they had written a piece of software internally that was a simulator, a business simulator, and you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that they were talking about the personal systems group. So this was the PC business unit at HP, and you had all these different levers, and you would, in terms of things you were investing in as the GM, the global GM. That was your role in the simulation. And you'd all of a sudden get a message that says, hey, Carly, expects you to contribute, 12 cents of EPS this quarter, right? And so you're going to have to make some choices immediately, right? And so you would make some of those choices, and then it would show you the consequences, the ripple effect consequences of those choices, 6, 12, 18 months later, right? So if you cut back product development, for example, well, now your whole product line is way late and you're behind the competitors and all this kind of stuff. But one of the things that was really fascinating about this, and was probably the object lesson, right, is that there wasn't any perfect choice. There was no free lunch. You were always going to get hit, right, by something. So when you think about, when you sat in meetings at Honeywell or some of these other companies that you've been the CFO for, and you're kind of calibrating these choices across time and space, realizing that you, like everyone else, have no idea what might happen in the world or to your industry or whatever in 12 months. How do you kind of ultimately shake all this out in your head? Which has got to be kind of, there's got to be a practical, process-driven side of it, but there's also kind of got to be this philosophical, almost metaphysical aspect of the decision-making too, right? So how do you do that?
Yeah, and I think part of it gets at knowing you have to have some level of conviction, right, in terms of what instinctively may feel right in terms of those investment decisions. But nonetheless, as a business leader, everyone, to your point, everybody has targets, be it no matter the organization. And then really thinking through, okay, do we have a line of sight to those targets and how are we going to attain them? But nonetheless, you always have to be thinking about where am I going to be allocating with the management team investments? And then where else as a management team maybe we de-emphasize investments? Because it's that trade-off that it's orchestration, if you will, among the teams and organization to say where best for us to free up capacity to make these investments for the future. But so much of it comes down to you can sit in a world and say, okay, it's all cost driven. You as the CFO, there's a real comfort level in, to certain dimensions that, okay, I can just issue targets. I need 5% reduction, 10% reduction, and everybody go off and go march on that path. Well, that will only get you so far, right? Because over time, if you're not effectively balancing and then figuring out, okay, what services, what products, what markets, what geographies, So I always found it in my instinct or working with my peers and other leaders within the business is how best to effectively think about that while you're managing to hit the current month's numbers, the current quarter's numbers, but then orchestrating, if you will, a way to free up. And my point earlier about making small bets or incremental bets in terms of, okay, if we're going to say we want to open a new market, we think that we should look at Southern Europe. And we want to put in X number of sales folks, pre-sales, and we want to do X amount. And we believe it will take X amount of time. Well, one of my roles as CFO is, all right, how are we going to fund that? And how are we going to free up the capacity? But that's my point about you can be one, or you could be the cost-cutting CFO person, but that can only get you so far. And I think
Right, you can only take the dollars out one time.
that incrementally then is how do you reallocate? So for me, there's an instinct to it, but then there's an orchestration to it. But it's also, I think, when you're working with the C-suite or the next level or two down, it's how do you create that headset of what's the objective? And that how do you not create the fiefdom mentality of I have to protect my budget, where you kind of create the atmosphere of come to me as the finance leader, to your point earlier on the question, come to me. You may not have something well thought out, you may not have it all baked out, but let's dialogue and, have some sense on what may be attainable, and then let's collectively figure out how we're going to finance it.
So, and I was going to originally ask this in a more broad sense, right? But I think it might help for people listening to it too if we made it more concrete. So the original question was going to be when a functional leader comes to you with a business case, what's typically missing, right? That you would really want to see, right? Like, is there kind of like an itch that's always there, kind of thing, right? But let's make it real. So, and it's one that everybody is going to recognize, particularly a lot of the people who follow this podcast. So, when marketing comes to you, right, during the budget season, and makes the case, what is typically missing in your mind? Like if you
I'd
were
say
going to
you were asking earlier on. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, if you're going to coach them, right, on how to give you a business case that will get funded, that because a business case is really an investment deal, right? So if you're the investor, what does success look like? Sure.
Because when you were asking earlier, what I frequently find missing is the dimension of time, meaning what kind of, Kevin, if we're going to run this type of campaign, here's our campaign plan. Here's what we're looking to do. I would say understanding a business, give me a time dimension. What should be the, say, KPIs? What are the indicators that we collectively, because I view it from a finance standpoint, sometimes we need to do a better job of collaborating more with the marketing organization. But if we understand, like my education would be for the marketing folks is, what are those key milestones or indicators we should look at as we're thinking about initiating a campaign, investing in a campaign, at what point in the trigger, right? Because it always seems you need to get to the nth of the milestone to see nirvana. That's when you see it, right?
Right.
And
Yep.
my whole coaching or my perspective would be, educate me, and if it takes 6 months, then let's figure out what's that investment requirement. But then what's the accountability we should hold each other to see how that campaign is doing. And that to me is what I find sometimes, that I frequently find is missing, is the dimension of time, because frequently everybody wants the big bang and they want it now. Like, Kevin, we need $1 million now. Kevin, we need $5 million now. And instead of saying, if we ask for 250 and we do X by month 1, see how this is proving out. right? And I think that's what's I find frequently is missing. And then the overall business case on incremental revenue, incremental cash, what is it that we're striving to attain with that program?
You know, when we kind of think about the exchange on this, one of the things that I think I've seen with a lot of companies now is that the CEO and the CFO assume that everyone understands the rules of the game, right? And they actually don't, right? And there's a like I had a conversation with a CEO not too long ago, and obviously it was very polite and all that kind of stuff, but it was essentially me saying, hey, you know, you realize that you co-own this problem that you have with marketing, right? You know, and he was kind of like, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, have you explained the rules of the game?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, does everybody know how you win and lose in this game? Well, no, that's probably true. We haven't done that, right? Is there a way that a scalable way that people can do that, where we kind of like literally put a nail through this problem?
Yeah, it is a no doubt an organizational dynamic in that particularly if you're a public company or even if you're a private equity, you know, there's usually two folks in front of the board or shareholders, and I think to the extent that, you know, the CEO and CFO engage more proactively on the communication of what external constituents are expecting, to kind of create that awareness. But I would say that organizational alignment, it's so much of it is tied to the messaging. You know, one of the things I would advocate for is, you know, if you're the head of marketing, you're the head of engineering, and you're having staff meetings, you know, proactively have, you know, the CFO or CEO attend and not only engage in understanding but understanding your team should be asking them questions of the CFO and really trying to drive that broader awareness. But peer-to-peer, I think it's owned by both constituents, be it, you know, the CFO, the head of marketing, head of engineering, sales, for everybody to kind of understand what the measuring posts are or what's the accountability that outside investors have, the board has, of the organization. Because we can debate a lot of different things, but if outside constituents have 5 key things that they're looking for, organizationally, things have to kind of align to those 5 things.
Right.
And that's a where much of it is that socialization, if you will, within an organization, to drive the awareness and the alignment between the CEO, the CFO, and the peer group.
So maybe this is another way of asking the question. So one of the things that you have to do in conjunction with the CEO is issue annual guidance, right? And then you're that's obviously out 4 quarters into the future. And then every time you go in front of the shareholders, the investors, right? You're on a quarterly basis, you're giving them updates against that and potentially revising the guidance, hopefully only in one direction.
Correct. Yeah, because that lower is not a good thing.
Right. So how do you, exclusive of everything else for a second, how do you do that? What's your process for deciding what your guidance will be? Because I have a feeling that there's a lesson there for functional leaders, right? When they're going through that same process with you, so you're now the investor, right, in their function, and at budget time, you're asking them to issue guidance as part of their business case, right? And then they have to come back and they have to, give an update against that, right? So how do you form your guidance?
Sure. I think so much of this, comes from most organizations, I would say, has a 3 to 5 year planning cycle. And fundamental
Like
to
at
that,
Honeywell, we would do the strap.
correct. It'd be at Honeywell, it'd be a 5 year plan, having that be, and so much of that leads to expectations that we as internally, right? Things have to be set up internally. But then when you start thinking about, okay, you would not want to see a business in decline, right? If you're there at the table, you would have to figure out, okay, what is it we collectively need to do to drive X amount of revenue growth, margin expansion, earnings growth, cash flow growth, and that's kind of fundamentally where it starts. So that most organizations, you do that depending on what your fiscal year is. You do that usually 6 months before your fiscal year begins. And what I have always witnessed is you go from the 3 to 5 year vision of how glorious the world is going to be, and then you get 3 months down, get 3 months down the road, and then you begin the annual planning process, that next year's planning process, and something oddly happens in a 90-day to 120-day time horizon. All of a sudden, that vision you had in the strategy session is no longer attainable in year one. So collectively, you got to say, okay, here's what we've done for the last 12 months, the last 18 months. So I personally am a big proponent of run rate to understand, okay, what's the momentum in the business, what's happening, and then when I start thinking about the next year, obviously you got to show some level of growth in the metrics we've talked about, right, as value creation. So you got to fundamentally say, okay, how are we going to do that? And then look at, okay, lines of business, investment levels, be it in product, be it in marketing, be it in sales. What are those investment levels to drive that plan? So when I think about an organization, obviously I'm going to hold the team internally to a threshold. So when I think about targets, those are usually going to be higher than what I'm going to message to outside constituents. Again, it's my own bias, but you're going to have a buffer or some, be it, there's different terms for it, contingency, breakage, all different terminology, but you as the CFO, CEO, you're going to hold the team to a higher accountability than maybe you're going to message outside. But then traditionally, I would work with, say, management, comp committee, others to ensure that the team gets incentivized properly to get there. But I think when you look at a functional level, historically, Mark, people will come in with last year's budget, right? And Kevin, I need 5% on top of that. And I have always struggled with, you got to press back as the CFO to the head of marketing and say, well, what was in that original 8 to 10% of the company budget? What did you do to free up capacity? You within your own function. Because everybody thinks it's just a layer. But we collectively as an organization, we might want to put more into R&D next year. We might be in a product refresh cycle. There may be things happening as an organization. Again, it's up to me to ensure the head of marketing or head of sales understands that. But it's kind of, what are you doing as a functional owner, as marketing, to look at and prove to the CFO that, hey, we did do X, Y, Z to free up capacity, but we believe by doing these incremental investments, here's what we're going to be able to derive. And here's the dates, here's the milestones, and here's the accountability I'm going to have. So I hope I'm answering your question because I know I answered a couple of different things, but
Yeah, yeah, totally. So one of the questions that I was asked by a listener to ask is and this is all in the context of 2020, right?
sure.
So in this particular company, finance came to marketing in like April of 2020 and said, guess what? We're cutting people and programs by 40%. The question is this. They obviously felt a lot of pressure, right, to be that conservative. Are business leaders, do they think about the long-term or longer-term effects of a cut like that? Or are they just really focused on meeting a short-term number?
Yeah, that is a really challenging question, right? Because fundamentally, you have to figure out as an organization if you make a commitment or a number, doing everything you can. But in the hindsight of 2020, the question earlier we were talking about, what business am I in? Am I a short cycle business, or am I in a longer cycle? And when I bring up longer cycle, I'm thinking about brand awareness. I'm thinking about pipeline growth versus point click generating sales in a shorter cycle business.
Right.
So I think fundamentally, business finance leaders, there's a lot of pressure, right, to say, okay, fundamentally, we just lost 50 to 60%, 70% of our sales. What's the best way for us to meet numbers? And I would say that there definitely is a lot of thought that goes into it. I would say, Mark, one of the things when we were at Honeywell, there was a lot of critique, a lot of debate. Probably one of the smartest things we did to protect long-term intellectual capacity, capability during the financial crisis was furloughs. A very controversial decision made by the executive team of Honeywell at that time. But in order to achieve the financial requirements, that was some of the decisions that had been made. I think when somebody says, okay, we got to reduce marketing by 40%, I think again it's that having the day in court, if you will, for the marketing leader and others in the organization to talk to the CFO about what trade-offs are they thinking about. And maybe it's 30%, 25%. But I assure you, during that crisis period of time, you get into target mentality, right? Everybody needs to participate. Everybody needs to share. But then there's got to be that ongoing dialogue between the leadership team on why is this good or why is this bad?
Right.
And what harm could we be doing to the business? But again, it gets into what cycle of a business are you in? Because in that person's business, right, when they were asked to give up 40% of the marketing dollars, how much sales were being foregone during that period of time, right? If I'm running an airline, I would have cut marketing by 80%, 90%, right? I mean, because there's no rhyme or reason to doing it. So that's kind of, it's a sensitive question, but it's a trade-off question as well.
And it seems to me that if you're waiting as a marketing leader or anyone else, right, to make that case when you get approached for that kind of cut, it's already too late. Because if they had a real clear understanding of the value that you were creating for the business across multiple time horizons, they would obviously probably think about that cut a little differently. Is there in your mind, is there sort of a stack rank of functions? I'm not asking you to list them, but is there a stack rank of functions that you feel like over time have earned the benefit of the doubt versus those that haven't?
Yeah, and I would say, and primarily if this is for the marketing, there's some opaqueness to it, right, between the two organizations. Because if you're in R&D, right, that's primarily a people-oriented product development. Then you have sales where, okay, you know how many folks are on the street, you know what the revenue numbers are going to be, or what the expectation is going to be. What I would say for marketing, again, and this is where this relationship with the finance teams, there's an opaqueness to me as a finance leader around advertising or marketing and what are the true results you're getting from that investment, and really pinpointing that I gave like X amount of investment leads to X amount of returns, revenue, earnings, cash flow. So
Totally, the cause and effect piece.
yeah,
Of it.
it's very difficult. Like for me, historically, it was just how best does that advertising or marketing really generate that revenue value? I've been part of organizations where marketing organization, not Mark, you never did this, don't get me wrong. But for every sales that was ever created, marketing took 100% of the credit. So then I always said, okay, well, what's the sales guy doing? And then it was like this thing's in tandem. So there are things that I feel there's an opaqueness that perhaps marketing and finance jointly working together can really do more on the criticality of advertising and outcome and value creation that you talked about earlier.
Is there a function in your experience across different companies that more oftentimes than not really has this nailed?
I'm going to reference one particular organization because it's the dimension of what they're held to on a quarterly basis. And it's sales. It's the sales organization, meaning, there's an expectation on revenue and, there's an expectation on conversion and just certain things that are happening, and a drumbeat of measurement. And they may not be the perfect organization for me to be referencing right now, but what I always felt was, they broke it down to how did we do this month? How did we do with the leads? And there's a cadence, and they have tools that they're better able to measure progress and how they're doing with leads or just that running track of information. So when I think of organizations, they're under maybe, there was a former leader you and I know well that used to talk about you can measure by a watch or you can measure by a calendar. And I felt sales always to me felt more as we have to understand where things are. And that's one organization that comes to my mind versus say R&D. It's, you can miss milestones and you're not going to miss your quarterly external revenue earnings numbers, right? You can have a delay of X amount of time.
Do you find product organizations generally have their business case buttoned up?
I would say they would have definitely a lot of the core metrics understood to be able to portray, and then also they'll lay out milestones that they would want the organization to hold them accountable to. Now, that's not to say that X% of certain of product R&D efforts may not be executed properly, and you could always have product delays. But definitely they would have some understanding of what it was that they were trying to get to.
So when we think about this, you've mentioned KPIs several times. I think one of the challenges in a function like marketing is that by the time something is a KPI, it's in the past. and there's nothing you can do about it, right? And it also isn't, it's like a score of an NBA game, right? It'll tell you who won and who lost, but it won't tell you the story of the game, right? What actions caused that score to happen. When you think about cause and effect, just in general, so again, not just talking about one function, how do you think about that, right? I mean, has it been feasible in the past to operationalize analytics to the point where you can really run cause and effect analysis on pretty much whatever you wanted to in the business, or has that been an area that's kind of been challenging for you?
I'd say, and I'll put a time dimension on it, right? If you go back, historically there'd be so much data, there'd be so much information, but it'd be very difficult, to your point, to pinpoint that intersection point on what led to X result based on that level of investment, right? And if you think about, I want to put X amount of salespeople in a territory. Traditionally, you could see,
right,
what did that mean from X amount of value or time?
Revenue per sales guy, incremental
revenue per sales guy. You could see, certain metrics, be it commission, certain things would. But again, to your point, it's a delay in terms of KPI, right? You would initiate, but you might not know. Maybe depending if you have my DNA, depending on the leader's DNA, you might put in more frequent measurements on monthly versus quarterly or versus annually. How is that situation evolving and happening? But I would say, and again, this is the time dimension, right? The technology today and the capabilities of today versus, say, even when you and I were working together back in the 2000s, it's such a different capacity, because the analytics, the capabilities of the data today, with the right framework, I'll point to, earlier I talked a little bit about the sales organization. I think one of the most powerful tools that's helped that organization and the finance organization was Salesforce. Really tracking through performance on the leads, and being able to really track that. That is much more of on to your earlier point about a delayed KPI. Well, to me, that's a actual living document, right? It gives you true measurement. It's not something that you're looking at, but I have KPIs within that tool set that I can look at very frequently, where 15 years ago, we didn't have that capability, right? So I think technology, that data, the data that we always historically took, 20 finance folks with 20 marketing folks, 20 sales folks to aggregate, put on Excel, that world has so much evolved in the last, 20 years that's really enabled such more, of an inflection point for us to be able to measure things more timely than we did, I think, years ago.
Yeah, I mean, when you and I were at Honeywell, I mean, what it took for us in marketing to run the analytics, absent any automation, was brute force. It was a brute force solution of lots and lots and lots and lots of data scientists, right?
Correct.
Compiling all that, and it made it very, very difficult to operationalize the analytic.
Correct.
Because you were always struggling to get the analytic fast enough where the opportunity in the future that it identified was still far enough in the future for you to actually do something about it.
No question. And I've been part of a couple of different consumer product company organizations, or maybe short cycle, and the lag, Mark, right? You would do a campaign, you do something, and you would only get proof points maybe every 6 months, 12 months, in terms of how are you doing, what's happening with that. Where I think in today's world, there's a much more efficient capability that organizations now can look to give them those inputs, those insights more timely. And then
It's still
toggle how should we be doing things, right?
absolutely.
Again, back in the day, we used to have the billboards, print, radio, something called radio, and TV, and you'd allocate X amount of money. And not sure how many folks on the podcast here are familiar with coupons. Some of us of our era would be, but coupon, like you decide, all right, how much money, how much are we going to allocate to these respective areas? But you wouldn't have enough perspective to know how are those investments doing. And then you couldn't do the toggle, the trade-offs, where I feel in today's world, to your point about from a marketing standpoint, I think there's definitely been advancement and maturity to understand from if you will, from a control tower or control perspective on how are we doing. I think that capability is definitely only accelerated for most organizations.
So I have one last question for you. It's a little bit of a tradition on the podcast already, and that is, when we think about value creation in our personal lives, our families, our communities, causes that we care about, how do you think about that, and how did you think about it, say, 20 and 40 years ago versus now, and how do you kind of think about that whole question?
Sure. Wow. That's a great question. I would say this. Maybe I'll start with an historical and then I'll bridge to today. I'd say, 20 years ago, it was value. How do I create value for myself, right? Because in terms of me meeting my wife, those were the early days of that value, creating value not only through our relationship, but value through my career, right? It's really where I was investing in time, gaining a lot of personal value, stimulation, energy out of pursuing a career in finance, right? That meant a lot. Say 10 years ago, kids enter my arena, and I really started thinking about, okay, how do I create a livelihood, create the right experiences for my kids, and to have that occur while I'm balancing career and family. Now that I'm, say, ladder of the back nine of the career, it's definitely more philanthropic for me personally, where I'm spending more time trying to give back. I've been very fortunate in values that I been able to attain, and like now it's all about how do I try and give back to those maybe less fortunate or those that need some finance help, be it philanthropically or other things. And that's where, like for me now, that's where I get my value is in that dimension. And I hope I'm answering your question, Mark. But it really is over that time horizon of where you are in life's journey, and somehow you got to balance, those different dimensions over time. But to me, early on, you have to add, you definitely have to allocate more of your time to the career and that foundational growth that leads to career success. It doesn't mean it leads to other successes, and that's where you got to really balance the formula as you go through life to, your family, your career, and then your other outside areas, your friends, everything. There's definitely a formula, but I don't know what the perfect formula is, but I think it definitely evolves over time.
So then 1B on this question, right, is,
Sure.
and actually there was somebody who knows you that asked me to ask you this, and that is, and it's sort of a predictable question, but I think everyone has very much their own answer to this. So what did 2020 teach you?
Boy, obviously the criticality of, I always use the word North Star. So the North Star of like knowing the criticality and the importance of family, right? I think that was of utmost importance to me. I think, if it was, thank God for technology, right? Thank God for the science. Thank God for the technology to create that interaction. But I think just knowing, the importance of family and the importance of just knowing that and knowing that we were all going to get through, somehow persevere through it. Obviously, it was a very difficult time.
Right. Absolutely. I think that one of the things that really made it difficult for a lot of people was the uncertainty, right? Not only day to day, but also the time scale issue,
Sure.
right? Which is sort of like, coming full circle, it's very similar to what some of the stuff we were talking about in business, right? How would you counsel people coming off of 2020 and even into right now, because there's still a lot of volatility and velocity and change right now, to think about those issues, right? Uncertainty. How much do you mitigate risk versus, and you could make this personal or make it corporate, but how much do you mitigate risk versus saying, you know what, I'm just going to freaking surf the wave, right? I'm going to try and make the most of this that I can. What have you learned from all that?
Again, this is all personal, but I definitely believe there are definitely better days ahead, right? So, in terms of, but the whole patience and understanding that, right? I think everybody's looking for some type of quick answer, quick thing to happen, and sometimes it just takes longer to see things, be it from an investment standpoint, personally. It's that you got to have that perseverance, right? And as a business, are you committed to the mission of the business, the products of the business, the people of the business? Similar to your family, that there's so many dimensions to it. But I think one of my life's greatest learnings is the criticality of during a crisis, during hard time, it's perseverance, right? And you gotta somehow find it in yourself to be able to kind of persevere to that next opportunity, right? Life's going to give you challenges. Life's going to give you opportunities. But it's just then how do you sustain it during this period of time? And I think as we're coming out of 2020 into 2021, I think there's definitely perseverance has been really important for me. But that goes back to other challenging times I've had, throughout the life's journey, right? I think it's just one of the things that I feel is of high importance. And then the other thing, Mark, I always talk about is context, right? It's my favorite English word because everything's got to be put into context for every individual, for every situation. We all look at things from our own lenses and its context, and putting things into context in a very proper way with a hardship or with success. It all comes down to how do you personally frame it, and how does that look to you, and what's the context for you? So, hope that makes some semblance of sense.
Oh, that was great. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you, Mark.
Absolutely. So, guys, you know what? I hope you really enjoyed this. Right? It's something that all of us are moving through right now. I don't care what function you have. We obviously talk about marketing a lot, but this is something that cuts across every part of an organization, and it also impacts every person's life, right? And so I hope that you've enjoyed what Kevin had to say, even the stuff that was sort of hard and maybe not what you wanted to hear, but I hope you profited from it anyway, because we are definitely here to create value for you. Thanks so much. See you next week.